I'm really great to see the Miller Theater fill tonight for a wonderful discussion, and we're going to learn a lot from Professor Jeanne Liedtka, a faculty member at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business. And I am delighted. I'm always eager to hear from professors because I always feel like I learn so much. And tonight we are going to be learning from one of the greats. And before we get started, I want to recognize Dean Scott Beardsley from Darden. Thank you, Dean Beardsley, for being here. And we have can I see a show of hands for UVA alums? Wow, we have a good turnout. Thank you, UVA. And I want to thank Ro King, who's on the Global Council for Darden. Ro has been one of our biggest fans here at Asia Society. And whenever Ro calls, we're really excited. And, you know, she has been a wonderful supporter of Asia Society, Hong Kong. And we can bring you programs like this tonight and bring you Professor Liedtka. And we're going to do some wonderful learning. And her current research is focusing on design-led innovation in government and social sector. And I'm sure we're going to hear about her forthcoming book, Designing for the Greater Goods. And she is getting calls from NASA. So it's really great to hear from that the government knows now how to use a really great mind like Professor Liedtka to help improve our life. We need all the help we can get these days. And, you know, it's been a really depressing week, but but just things around the world, whether it's London or US, but we can still design for good. And so tonight we're going to hear about this particular topic. And I want to thank Jeanne Liedtka for being here. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. And then get ready for the questions. I know we have a lot of students tonight from APA, UST, Hong Kong U, Ningnan, and all that. So students, get ready for your questions. And so on that note, we're going to invite Professor Liedtka to get the program started. Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful to be here in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for coming. I said, normally I'm used to drinking after my presentations rather than before, but I trust that you'll be forgiving. But it's wonderful to be here and to have a chance to talk about design thinking. What I'd like to do is to first set a little context behind the idea of why design thinking. Why now? Why suddenly are we hearing about this new methodology and toolkit when really it's been around for a very long time? We just didn't notice it outside of probably the product development people. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about how I define design thinking and give you an example. And then talk just at the end for a bit about our experiences at Darden teaching design thinking and what we've learned about the potential to have it both taught and scaled broadly in organizations. And again, scaling is important because, as you can tell from the subtitle of this talk, fundamentally, I think one of the most exciting aspects of design thinking is the fact that it lets us democratize innovation. We have the opportunity to make innovation everyone's job, not the job of a select few. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about also why I think that's so important. So if we look at the context, we live, it seems, increasingly in a world with accelerating uncertainty, increasing complexity, and what designers love to call wicked problems. Right? And a wicked problem in the design sense is a problem where you usually have multiple diverse stakeholders who can't even agree on a definition of the problem, much less how to solve it. And in many ways, innovation has been seized upon as kind of the silver bullet, right? The way to help us protect our jobs from the robots, right? To deal with all of the political issues and turmoil that are going on around us, to deal with a globalizing world, right? all kinds of challenges. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about that because for many of us, innovation really remains a black box. One of my favorite examples of what innovation is about comes, of course, from Apple, right? Their head of creative services, who, when he was asked to describe their innovation process, drew this. Right? Now, for those of us who are in management, that's a pretty daunting picture. Right? Because what does it say? It says that innovation is this kind of magical, mysterious process that something goes in and then amazingly appears at the other end, but we really don't know how it happens or why it happens. And as a result, we really can't teach it to people. At some level, this leads to something that I call the Moses myth. This idea that innovation leaders, in order to lead innovation, you have to be a heroic character, right? You have to be Steve Jobs or Jack Ma or Moses, someone who is essentially anointed by God, right? And they raise their staff and the Red Sea parts. And the rest of us just kind of sit on the banks knowing that if we tried that, we'd drown. Right? And so that's the challenge. I think it does the world a tremendous disservice if we believe the Moses myth, because the question becomes, what are the other 99.9% of us supposed to do while we're waiting for Moses to come and innovate? Right? And so the opportunity with design thinking is to, I think, challenge the Moses myth, and in part also challenge this myth that design is really largely about technology, that it's largely about giant disruptive things, that it's about products that come out of research and development labs. All of those things are important parts of innovation. But every individual we work with has the opportunity to find ways to innovate in their own world. One of the things I'll ask you to do is to accept in innovation that innovation doesn't mean something that's new to the world. Innovation means creating value for people that they don't have access today. Right? In the business world, we know that we are largely about creating value. Novelty for the sake of novelty has no value. Right? So when we talk about design thinking, we're not talking about building more cool stuff that people don't need, right? And that in some way caters to a very small percentage of the world's population. Most of the really exciting uses that we're seeing in design thinking are happening recently in the social sector, which is the new book that we've come out, where we've studied its use in government, in charitable foundations, in nonprofit organizations of all kinds. And I think the stories coming out of that are really inspiring, and I'll hope to share a few of them with you. So this is the Moses myth that we want to reject, and we want to say, really, design thinking is something we can all do. In many ways, for me, I think we're looking at something that parallels the quality movement post-World War II. So think about it. In business, at least, at one time, we thought quality was something that experts did. Right? And then we learned that quality was something that everyone had to do in the world in order for organizations to prosper and survive. And I think we're seeing that same shift in innovation now, that it's not only about a small group of leaders who do it, a small group of people in research and development, a small group of entrepreneurs like Jack Ma and Steve Jobs. It's something that we all can do our own flavor and our version of. And what gets called innovation doesn't have to be something big and grand. It can be just something that makes someone's life better the next day. Now, having said that, it's easy to say innovation is everyone's job. Our research, however, suggests that the activities that go with being successful at innovation come much more naturally to some of us than to others. So I want to tell you the story of two managers who have very different attitudes and approaches and mindsets. Both of them are smart, both of them are dedicated, both of them want to give great value to the people they serve, but one succeeds and one fails. And I think understanding the challenges of failure is a lot of the message of why design thinking really helps. So let's meet George first. George has something that psychologists call a fixed mindset. And I don't know if some of you have read the work of people like Carol Dweck, who's a Stanford University psychologist. She essentially studies school-age children. Right? And yet, I think her work has more to say about the leadership in organizations and the success of senior managers than any other piece of research I know. She argues that all of us, at a relatively early stage in our life, usually in the early primary grades, pick up one of two mindsets. George has picked up a mindset that life is a test, so he will spend his life trying not to look stupid, which for George means never making a visible mistake. because he's learned to equate being smart with being right. And again, that sounds like a kind of a silly thing to emphasize. Being smart is being right. But as soon as we come to define ourselves as smart only when we're right, it makes it very difficult, we know, to succeed in innovation in an uncertain environment. And we'll talk some more about why. But I want to contrast that with Jeff's mindset. Jeff has what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. And again, part of it we think is probably personality. Part of it is formative experiences. But George and Jeff can sit next to each other in elementary school, and one has one mindset and the other has the other. Jeff, for some reason, believes that life is a journey of learning. So he believes that he can get better at things just by trying and persisting. So there's interesting research where they'll take kids with the two different mindsets and they'll give them both a math problem that is really too difficult for either of them to solve at the grade level they're at. What they find is that the Jeffs of the world will persist far longer in trying to solve the problem than will George, who pretty quickly gives up. You take these two mindsets, and the first negative consequence that George learns is to be afraid of uncertainty. And again, that's not an irrational fear. Whenever we step outside of the world of what we know, we're more likely to make a mistake. And if we live our life trying not to make mistakes, then we live our life trying to avoid circumstances that take us out of what we already know and are already good at. Jeff, on the other hand, is accepting of uncertainty. Now, he's not seeking uncertainty. In fact, one of the myths of entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurs are risk seekers. The difference between entrepreneurs in a lot of research and traditional managers is entrepreneurs are willing to manage necessary risk. Most of us are taught, especially those of us who grew up in large organizations, to avoid all risk. You cannot innovate and avoid risk. What Jeff and entrepreneurs both know is that you must accept some risks that are necessary to innovation, but that doesn't mean you take all risks. As a result of this, one of the first things we find is that most of the time in business school, we haven't taught people how to manage risks. We've taught them to avoid risk. So one of the things that we'll be talking about, one of the big advantages of the design thinking toolkit is really as a risk management device. It teaches us how to manage the risks that we can avoid in order to succeed at innovation. But if we go back to George, therefore, as we said, has been avoiding new experiences a lot, whereas Jeff has been seeking them. The result of that is it impacts their repertoire. And repertoire here we're using in the same way we would use a musician's repertoire. It's kind of how many pieces do we know well and can play by heart. George generally has grown up in a silo and contained his experiences to one kind of environment. Because of that, he has a very deep repertoire, but can really only play one song. Right? Now, in a static environment, instead of calling George's repertoire narrow, we would call him an expert, right? He would have an expert repertoire, and that would be a great thing. But as soon as we step into the environment of uncertainty, a lot of the opportunities we see because we've seen them somewhere else in some other environment. And the more we've constrained the environments we're exposed to, the less likely it is that we'll see opportunity. Right? Now, this continues the kind of dichotomy between their two behavior in how they understand the people that they're trying to serve. George tends to understand the people he tries to serve as data points. Right? Chances are he has lots of market research reports and lots of information. The trouble is he doesn't really know them as people. And when we begin to look for really attractive growth opportunities in the business world, generally we're looking for differentiated value propositions. Right? We're looking for something that no one else has done yet, because that's where we are more likely to be profitable in the long term. Right? If all we do is understand the people we're trying to serve as data points, it is very difficult to anticipate in advance what they will want. We kind of have to wait until they tell us. Now, we know from a lot of other research that most of us are notoriously bad at seeing any future that looks very different than the present we're living in. right? It is the great gift of artists and architects and people in the creative arts that they are able to see what most of us can't. So the principle of asking people that you're trying to serve what they want generally is a bad one, right? Because they really don't know what they want. And this is where Tom Peters had a great comment where he said, the customer is a rear view mirror. Right? We better make sure they're following us, but we can't expect them to tell us what's out ahead. Right? That's our job as innovators. Now, on the other hand, for some reason, and again, we're not really sure from our research why, Jeff is drawn to understanding the people he serves as human beings. And this is something we'll talk a lot about with design. Human-centered design is an alternative term for design thinking because design always starts by trying to serve one particular set of individuals, rather than kind of a faceless mass market captured in data. So one of the stories that in our research that for me is really sets these apart was a manager who was in charge of the startup of for M&M Mars, their custom M&Ms. Have custom M&Ms come to Hong Kong yet? Where literally if you go to a birthday party now in the US or a shower or something, it says, congratulations, Sue and Jeanne, on your tiny little M&M. It's pretty remarkable, right? But we asked him what it meant to be customer-centric, because as we were doing this research, it was very clear that you can't tell someone in a business organization, for instance, to become customer-centric. We've known that for 20 years, right? But there was something different about how these managers were being customer-centric. And so we asked this manager when he talked to his people about focusing on the customer, being customer-centric, what it meant. And he said, I don't ever use the term customer-centric. I don't like that term. I want my people to be Cynthia-centric. We said, well, what does that mean, Cynthia-centric? He said, let me tell you about Cynthia. Cynthia is a young single mother living on very limited income. And for her son's 5th birthday party, she decides, even though she can't afford it, to order him custom M&Ms. Right? Now, is Cynthia doing that because she needs more sugar at his birthday party? Probably not, because she would go to the local drugstore or supermarket in that case. Right? Clearly, those M&Ms have a job to be done, which is the parlance that designers should do, that is not about the product. It's about a message to her son and to herself, probably, right? That she's a good mother and that he deserves nice things. Well, as this manager says, when we fail to deliver the M&Ms in time for the party, but instead they arrive 2 days later, I don't want anyone who works for me to think that we missed a shipment. I want them to think that we had a chance to make Cynthia's life better, and instead we let her down. Right? So again, we can talk about being customer-focused, but very different interpretations of it. And we'll talk a lot more about that, because this is one of the cornerstones of design thinking, this notion of empathy and of serving human beings and understanding both their functional and their emotional needs at any given point in time. So when we combine George's relatively narrow repertoire with this very analytic, data-based understanding of customers, it is very hard for him to see innovation opportunities. And again, it's not because he doesn't try. It's not because he doesn't work hard or because he doesn't care or because he's not smart. It's because he has a repertoire that has not equipped him to have a broad view of the possibilities. And because the data he has to work with basically gives him superficial insights into the people whose lives he's trying to change. Whereas Jeff, because he's had a broader set of experiences and because he has this very deep hypotheses usually about what people need, is able to see all kinds of opportunities. In fact, one of the interesting things that we find in our research is these managers who go in and find substantial growth opportunities, nothing changes when they come in. So for instance, competitors haven't changed, customers haven't developed new needs, there hasn't been a technology revolution. They are simply able to walk into the same situation that other managers have been for a long time and to see an opportunity that no one else saw. So one of the real challenges we have as we think about how to make innovation accessible to everyone is how do we help people to see the opportunities that we know are there, but that are invisible to us because of the perspective we bring. There's one other very significant change that we saw between the two managers in our research. One is the difference between managing risk through analysis versus managing risk through action and experimentation. Again, many of us are taught who grow up in a business environment or a government environment that the way you make decisions is you take lots of data from the past and you try and use it to predict the future. Right? Now, I mean, obviously that works very well when your future looks a lot like your past. But at some level, it's pretty obvious if we're trying to invent a future that doesn't exist, how can we possibly use data from the past extrapolated to prove it's a good idea? So this is one of the other dilemmas we see people get into. They're asked to prove that an idea about the future is good in the present without having tried it. The Jeffs of the world realize pretty quickly that that is impossible. You can sit in your office and run your Excel spreadsheets, and you can keep putting new numbers in, but it's all made up until you actually go out and interact with real people with some kind of prototype of a product. You're never really going to know what the potential is. So that's another thing. As a result, George ends up paradoxically placing big bets slowly. So he spends his life trying to avoid taking risks, but in the end, he ends up taking a lot more risk than he needs to. He waits because he never has enough data to be sure he's proven himself right? And he usually bets on one idea. Whereas Jeff, having even never been to Silicon Valley and learned about failing fast and cheap, just intuitively understands that this is about placing lots of small bets. And again, this is something that we know well from the world of venture capital. When a venture capitalist invests in 10 businesses, right, what's the data on how many will likely turn into profitable businesses? Well, I think the current number is, if they're really good, 1.8. Right? So 8 out of 10 times, no matter how smart I am and no matter how hard I do my work and all of this, I am going to be wrong. Does that change what we do? Well, of course it does, because we understand that we have to manage a portfolio of businesses, and we have to recognize that knowing when to get out of the 8 that don't work is actually just as important, if not more so, than doubling down on the 2. Because it's really a process of elimination of those 8 that lets us get to the 2. Right? So as we step back, we see George failing more often and sadly using all of the behaviors that have led him to be successful in a stable environment. Right? Whereas George succeeds more often. It's not that George doesn't fail. George fails a lot, but he tends to fail in his small bets under the radar. And so his failures are much less visible. Now, the interesting question, of course, for a teacher is not Jeff, because Jeff doesn't need help, right? He has adapted a set of behaviors quite naturally that will help him to innovate, right? Now, I don't think you want Jeff running the maintenance part of your business, right? So it isn't as though one skill set is good and one skill set is bad. It's just that one approach to is much more conducive to an uncertain environment where your goal is innovation. So the interesting person is George from a teacher's viewpoint, right? Because most of us are George. I should ask you to think about the organization you work in and to what extent these archetypes, and again, they're extreme archetypes, right, reflect the people you work with. Most of the people that I work with at the Darden School are George, because it's the Georges of the world who've generally been rewarded and promoted and produce the kind of output that everyone wants business people in particular to produce. Right? So the question is, how do we help George to innovate? And that's where design thinking comes in, because what design thinking brings is a toolkit and a process to help George do what Jeff does naturally. So for instance, we'll talk about tools like journey mapping in a minute that help us create stakeholder empathy. Jeff doesn't need journey mapping. He already understands that he needs to pay close attention to the actual emotional experiences of people as they interact with his product or service. But the journey mapping tool can be the difference that gives George access to data that he wouldn't have otherwise. So as we look about then what is design thinking and think about how we use it to help George, I define it as just a systematic approach to problem solving. In this way, it is inherently not any better or any worse than all the other methodologies we have for problem solving. What it is uniquely suited to conditions of high uncertainty, and most of the problem solving tools in our arsenal assume that we can predict the future from the past. Right? So design thinking has these three qualities that to me distinguish it from the kind of decision-making, problem-solving approaches that by and large most of us have been taught. Right? First is that it fundamentally is concerned with empathy. That is, it starts with the human needs. Right? It doesn't start with technology. That's technology-driven innovation, which is also important and vital. But design thinking starts by identifying a particular set of human beings. And if I can't find those human beings to talk to, then I can't really do the front end of design thinking, right? Because they are not theoretical people. They are actual people who will share with me some of their experiences in life. So we start with empathy. The second is, it is really important that we begin with the possibility space. So for instance, I'm a strategist by training, right? We know that all great strategies have three elements, right? They have a possibilities element in which we're trying to invent a new future. They recognize constraints, however, what are the real capabilities we've got to work with in the resources, and they acknowledge the uncertainties that we can't control. So possibilities, constraints, and uncertainties. When you look at most strategic planning processes, they start with constraints. And if we start with constraints, then we never invent a world that looks very different than the world we're already living in. Design thinking explicitly says, and this can be really hard for business people especially, step away from constraints and ask the question, if anything were possible, what would I create, given what I've learned about the needs of the stakeholders I'm trying to serve? Now, we know anything isn't possible. And later in the process, we're going to factor the constraints and the uncertainties back in. But if we let them in too soon, they drive out of the process all of the stuff we really care about. Because it turns out often that the creativity that matters the most, especially in large organizations, whether they're government, nonprofit, or business, the creativity that matters the most is not coming up with the idea. It's figuring out how to get the idea through the bureaucracy and out the door, right? And that takes tremendous energy, as anyone who's ever tried to accomplish change in an organization knows. The only way people do that is if they get so excited about a possibility, they get incredibly creative around how to end run the constraints. The analogy that one of the faculty members at Darden, Alec Horniman, that I teach with uses, is he always says, think about a rocket on a launch pad. You know, before takeoff, there's so much energy built up underneath it, it just bounces up and down. And the reason that is because it takes a lot more energy to escape the Earth's pull of gravity than it does to orbit in space. Right? It's the same thing with any change we try and make. If we don't invest in building energy for change, when we actually go to make the change, we're going to run out of steam. Right? Possibilities conversations engage people emotionally and build the energy for change. That turns out to be absolutely critical when we move into the implementation space. The third element, and again, thinking back to the element of uncertainty, is the first solutions are only places we begin. We never expect to get it right the first time. We expect it to be a process of learning and of iteration, a process really of hypothesis generating and testing, right, that we'll get better at as we go along. The way we've worked with non-designers on this is to say, at its simplest level, the design thinking process wants us to answer 4 questions. The first question is, what is? It wants us to stay in the problem space instead of running to the idea generation part. Stay in the problem space and first of all, make sure we've got a good definition of the problem. One of the places we lose most innovation opportunities is right up front in defining the problem so narrowly and so conventionally that we leave out all the really exciting solutions because we haven't defined a problem that even allows them into the conversation. Right? So this what is stage is often the hardest ones for a lot of us to take because we're action oriented and we want to go solve something, but it turns out to really hold the secret that allows us to be data-driven when we get to idea generation, not by our own assumptions about what someone wants, but actually from data that we've gathered. Once we've explored the current situation using tools like journey mapping, we're ready to move into ideation. Right? The difference in the kind of brainstorming ideation we'll talk about in design thinking is it drives off the data we've gathered during the what is process. Right? And I'll give you an example of that. Then, unfortunately, we have to let reality back in. The final two stages are testing stages, in which we're trying to assess first kind of theoretically and with some very small scale customer conversations, whether an idea will work, right? And then finally, we're trying to see what works in these small scale experiments that we call learning launches in the real world. So let's look at what that looks like in a real problem. This is an example from Denmark, right? Where many, 125,000 or more of their senior citizens rely on government-sponsored meals. Unfortunately, an estimated 60% of them have poor nutrition. And these are even people living in assisted living facilities, right? So the meals are available, the food is there, they have poor nutrition. And amazingly, 20% of them are actually malnourished. So with this problem definition, the municipality in charge of all this, Hostelbrouw, invites this design firm called Hatch and Bloom in and specifically mandates that the nature of the project is to fix the menu, right? That's a great example where we've got a conventional definition of the obvious, right? If we put different food in front of them, they will eat it, right? Fortunately, designers never do what they're told, and so they ignore that. And they enter the what is process, and they use this tool called journey mapping, which is, I think, of all the tools in the design thinking arsenal, one of the easiest to teach and one of the ones that produces the most outstanding results. Right? Essentially, we want to trace the journey of a stakeholder as they experience a product or service. So in some ways, we talk a lot about things like the value chain and the supply chain in business. You can think of kind of the value chain at a company level and the journey map as belonging to an individual customer experiencing that product or services, end to end. So we don't limit it to just the part that we do, right? We broaden it to try and understand what is the job they're trying to accomplish. For instance, as we think back to Cynthia and those M&Ms. So the Hatch and Bloom followed the meals. So they start in the kitchen as the meals are being prepared, even though they've been told by the client that they're really not supposed to incorporate the kitchen as part of their research because everything's fine, right? They start in the kitchen, they follow the meals, they drive with the drivers, they sit with the elderly people as they unwrap them and work with them and eat them and clean up after them. And they try and understand at a deeper level what's really going on. They find some interesting things. First of all, they find out that people are embarrassed to accept aid from the government, right? So in Denmark, at least, the idea is if we have needs, our family is supposed to help us fulfill them. And if our family can't help us, then we're allowed to pay someone to help us. But if we have to accept assistance from the government, that's a bad thing. So people don't want the cars pulling up in front of their house because it says to their neighbors that they're having to accept money from the government, meals from the government. The second, I think this is a very interesting one, the most depressing and painful thing other than getting old and losing control over our own body is losing control over our food choices. Right? So we're having a meal delivered every day and I have no choice, and because of the lack of choice, I have no appetite. In addition, they discover that people are lonely eating alone. These are single package meals that are delivered. So people eat alone, they don't eat as much. And secondly, and I think this one is particularly interesting, these people miss the seasonal food of their youth. So for instance, we're used to eating strawberries year round now, and we think that's a good thing. I mean, who would want to only be able to eat strawberries in the summer? Amazingly, they have a sense of loss associated with strawberries all year round. They like the idea that you eat apples in the fall and you eat strawberries in the summer. And then finally, the other thing they find is in this kitchen that they're supposed to be ignoring. The kitchen workers are just as bored and unmotivated for exactly the same reason that the people they're serving the meals to are bored and unmotivated, because they're cooking the same thing day after day with no choice. Right? So as we look at what's going on below the surface, it's clear that merely putting different stuff on the menu, had they accepted that as the definition of the problem, wouldn't really have helped them very much. So they now move into the what if stage with idea generation, and we look at another design thinking tool called co-creation. Again, very powerful. The idea of co-creation is instead of designing for people, we design with people. Right? We invite a broader group of people into the idea generation process. This turns out to be really critical in an environment of uncertainty. In an environment of stability, we prefer homogeneity. That is, we try and reduce variance. In an environment of uncertainty, we actually want to increase the variance of both the input and the output because we're shifting from a focus purely on efficiency, which is about reducing variance, to a focus on adaptability, which really benefits from increasing variance. So we start to see this notion of having a diverse collection of individuals in the room, or as Peter Senge would have said in the learning world, right? Putting the whole system in the room. That diversity of perspectives is what is going to allow us to create a better solution than what anyone brought into the room in the first place themselves. Right? Now, we know often, though, when you put a whole bunch of people with diverse perspectives in the room, it isn't as though creativity happens. Debates and hostility happen. Right? So one of the ways to think about what design thinking also brings is something that some have called a social technology for better conversations. That is, it structures the conversation. It just doesn't put the people in the room and say, okay, now, go to it. Right? Instead, it puts them in the room, it shares with them the data that we've gathered and their own perspectives, and it kind of orders and structures the conversation in a very particular way. So in this case, they have a series of workshops, which includes everybody from the elderly themselves to municipal officials to employees who are working with people in residential care centers every day, the volunteers, the kitchen workers, and the experts on elderly issues. And together they brainstorm. One of the things that we'd often do for brainstorming is use something that designers call trigger questions. Part of the trouble is we're kind of prisoners of our own way of looking at the world, and particularly in our own industries, whether it's government or business, we tend to adopt an industry mentality, right? The way we've always done things in this part of the world, so we fail to see opportunities to do things differently. One of the best ways to get people to do that is something that designers call analogous reasoning. We make people leave their kind of definition of the world and step into another. Now, in this case, you're stepping into a world that's pretty close because they're saying, what if instead of a public service food delivery organization, you were a restaurant? That's hardly a radical leap, right? But what are the implications of that? Well, if instead of being a kitchen, I was a restaurant, then instead of being a cook, I'd be a chef. And how would we treat the people in the kitchen differently if we thought of themselves, we thought of them, and more importantly, they thought of themselves as chefs? Well, if we were a restaurant, then the vehicles that deliver the food are the waiters, and we might want to think about what kind of waiters we want and the quality of the service that's being given there. And then instead of just describing that day what people were going to get to eat, we'd have a menu. Right? And so we'd be brainstorming through each of these ideas to try and generate things that we haven't thought of before. When we've got a portfolio of ideas, and the portfolio part is really important. In my experience working with this, people will fall in love with the first idea they've got and want to stop there. And yet, when you're forced to generate a portfolio of 10 ideas and take them to the stakeholder, it's really very rare that the stakeholder picks the idea that you fell in love with as your first idea, right? So we're moving now into testing, though, because we can't afford to move into marketplace testing all of our ideas. So we're looking for something that we call the wow zone. The wow zone says, first, stakeholders want it because there's no reason to ask any other questions if nobody wants it. And in fact, the biggest reason for the failure in business of new products and services is we create stuff and then nobody wants it when we bring it out to the market. So a lot of the front end of design thinking is making sure somebody wants it. But now we're starting to ask the capabilities question. Can we do it? Right? And if we can't, can we find the partners to do it with us? Right? So partnering becomes really critical at this stage because oftentimes we're coming up with a portfolio of ideas that we can't easily deliver all by ourselves. And then finally, whether we're a profit or a nonprofit, we have to have a set of economics that sustain it. In for-profit business, that leftover we'll call profit, but in government and in public service and nonprofit, we have to balance the books, right? We're looking for the intersection of those three, and that's the wow zone. So the way we usually deal with it is we now go out and have a preliminary series of conversations, one-on-one with customers, using very crude prototypes like storyboards to begin to get their reaction, right? And again, we want to do things like always give people choices, because inaccurate feedback is our biggest problem, right? In many ways, if you want to manage risk, the false positive is what you're trying to remove. Because false positives are where we spend money and then don't end up with demand associated with it, right? And because most people are nice and want to be pleasant, they don't give you good data, right? So if I hold up my watch and I say, what do you think of my watch? Right? Most of us are going to say, well, she seems to like it, and it's her watch, so it looks great on you. I love it, right? Contrast that with me holding up two pictures, two sketches drawn of two different watches and saying, what do you think? Do you like these watches? What do you like? What do you don't like? The quality of the feedback I'll get is entirely different. I've depersonalized it, right? I'm not inviting you to say you love it. Right? I'm literally inviting you to give me the cold, hard facts about your reaction to it. So as we begin to move into what wows, one of the things we have to teach managers is to stop selling their idea when they're supposed to be testing it. Because most of us are so used to selling an idea to someone, we don't even realize it when we're trying to get them to give us a positive outcome, which is the last thing we want if we're trying to get accurate feedback. Right? Then in the final stage of what works, we're basically creating these closer to minimum viable product kind of prototypes that we can actually put out there and see what the reaction is. One of my favorite things they prototyped, and here what's important is that we make it tangible and concrete. We're not asking people if they'd like the idea. We're trying to simulate the experience and seeing how that feels to them. Right? So for example, one of the ideas one of the challenges they had that they spent a lot of time thinking of was, how do we deal with the alienation of both the elderly who are sitting at home feeling alone and the kitchen workers who are churning out these meals with no sense of why they're doing it and what they're doing it. So someone comes up with a very simple idea of a note card that they'll put in the meal, right? Pretty straightforward, right? Just to see if the people who are eating the meals want to give any feedback to the kitchen people. So they start off thinking it in a very conventional way as a feedback device. Well, it turns out that the elderly people start attaching photographs and things to this, that the people in the kitchen begin to answer, right, and hang up, and what around the kitchen. And what they find is, amazingly, it builds a relationship, so that at some point the people in the kitchen begin to feel they know the individuals they're cooking for, and the people at home begin to feel that the people cooking for them know them and care about them, right? And that's remarkable in and of itself. So in the end, we started off with this question, this mandate to go fix the menu. And through these 4 questions of the design thinking process, we end up with some solutions, some of which we would have come up with anyway, but many of which are completely different. And probably none of them are shattering and earth-breaking and new to the world, right? But together, they create an enormous amount of value, both for the people in the kitchen and the people this is one of my favorite quotes. If you have professional pride, you'll also cook good food. Good food has to come from the heart. This is from the director of the kitchen, who specifically told the consultants not to talk to the people who worked in the kitchen because it was irrelevant. Right? And in fact, this is one of the most, I think, incredible outcomes we see of the design thinking process. It's not that it just produces stuff people like, it changes the way people think about their customers, about their colleagues. It changes the way we converse with each other in organizations about innovation opportunities. Right? Very powerful in that way. So lots of other examples. We've studied about 40 cases in depth. Everything from IBM using it to reimagine the whole trade show experience, from something that's I hawk things at you in a bright, gaudy, loud way. We're seeing a tremendous amount of its use in healthcare, because of course so much of the healthcare journey is an emotional one, right? And some really outstanding institutions, Monash University Medical Center is in Melbourne, Australia. A group of doctors there came to Darden for our class and got all excited and went back, and they're leading really the redesign of a lot of the patient experiences there. They're reducing long patient stays. Sometimes they're working on things as modest as how do we get people to wash their hands? And at other extremes, they're thinking, how do we keep suicidal patients who show up in the emergency room from overdosing again after they've left? So it's really impressive stuff. We see it used a lot in the B2B space. Again, there's this notion that something like design thinking is good for consumer products only, but in fact, there's tremendous power in the B2B space. And we see people like 3M using it a lot in that space. Used for strategic planning. The obvious areas like customer care center. A lot of entrepreneurial startups are using it. Again, oftentimes, one of the challenges is an entrepreneur starts with an idea and then doggedly pursues it against all odds. It can be very useful to introduce that front end of the assessment of the customer needs as part of it. Right? We're seeing some really interesting uses of it in Washington, D.C. Now, it may be hard to believe that anything positive is actually still going on in Washington, D.C., but buried in the heart of the bureaucracy at places like the Food and Drug Administration, people are using design thinking to bring people like the regulators, and of course in the US government you often have 3 or 4 different sets of regulators who don't talk to each other, right? To bring regulators together with members of the healthcare professions, with the manufacturers of medical devices, and really for the first time to sit down and talk to each other face to face and try and arrive at common definitions of the problem. In the case we profile, one of the amazing things that the FDA learned early on was that regulations were in fact not the solution to the problem they were finding in the marketplace. It was improper usage, that regulations would have had no effect whatsoever. And then finally, some of the most exciting work I've seen is organizations who are deliberately trying to scale innovation at the front lines and offering people the tools to do it. This story is from the U.S. Health and Human Services Administration, employs 80,000 people around the country. The case we profile is a young woman who's a quality control worker at an Apache Indian reservation hospital in Arizona, who sees an opportunity, and the way that works is any of the 80,000 employees who has an idea can enter it into a competition. The best ideas are selected, and then the people involved are given training in design thinking, lean startup, some mentoring. Their supervisors are worked with to give them the time to do the work. Marlis's idea is probably going to save this hospital $6 million next year. Right? And again, to hear her talk about it, there's a wonderful quote that I wish I'd put in here in which she basically says, it never occurred to me that I had the capability to do this, right? Until the email from the Accelerator program appeared in my inbox, and I thought, I've got ideas, maybe I can, right? Really impressive stuff. So as we step back and say, so what about this design thinking? What does it really do for us? The research on actual outcomes is still in its infancy. I mean, we've done a lot of qualitative case-based research, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. But from our perspective right now, it looks to be to have real potential not only for producing more creative ideas, which is the obvious thing it's supposed to do, but a set of other things that are far more powerful than just another good idea. Teaching people how to manage risk, paving the way for the kind of behavioral changes you need people to make in order to implement new ideas, increasing the speed of innovation. Because it turns out if we actually are just patient and we invest in the learning right up front about needs, and we engage people in that process, it goes a lot faster than fighting your way through an answer in the bureaucracy when you haven't invited anyone to be part of the process with you. One of the most exciting things, I think, is this idea of using design thinking to build local capabilities. We know, and I'll spare you a foray into the world of complex adaptive systems, but we used to think that organizations were like machines. We controlled them. They did what we told them to do. They were like our cars. We stepped on the gas and they went faster. What has always been obvious in areas like government, right, is that they are not things. They are complex social systems. And in these complex social systems that are increasingly chaotic because the level of uncertainty in the environment, successful decision-making in chaotic social systems usually works best at the local level. You see a pretty profound failure of centralized decision-making because all of the good data that you really need to think intelligently is happening locally, not at headquarters. Right? So the more we can, in a rigorous way, push decision-making to the local level, the more likely it is we can come up with good solutions that actually will get implemented as well. Right? So we see a lot of organizations, for instance, one that we've studied that works to improve transportation opportunities for low-income workers in relatively rural places that don't have good mass transit systems. Instead of mandating solutions centrally, they've basically used design thinking to create a set of diverse local groups who define their own problems and define their own solutions, but share what they've learned with each other, all with the backbone of design thinking as the methodology that keeps them rigorous and that allows them to share kind of a platform for exchanging information. And then finally, I think in this world of ours where there's so much division and diversity, right? I think one of the most exciting ideas is this notion of design thinking as a methodology, a kind of a social technology for convening conversations for change across diverse stakeholders. Right? We know that diversity holds the key to creativity in theory, but in reality, unless we manage the conversation, diversity generally deteriorates, and in the face of diverse groups, we have slower, worse decisions than if we just had a homogeneous group of people make them. So design thinking gives us the opportunity to do that. One of the most exciting things we found teaching it is that it is teachable and scalable, but it's not teachable with just the 4 questions. So as we've worked with non-designers, especially business people, engineers, scientists, teachers, doctors, we found that the Georges of the world need more structure than 4 questions gives them. So at least early on, we found that it's important to kind of lay out a much more detailed methodology that kind of shoves George through the process. Because what we found is once someone's gone out the other end and experienced success with the process, they've got the confidence to go back and go through it on their own. But the best part of this, in my view, is the way it lends itself to online. So at Darden, we've invested quite a bit in developing online materials. There's a lot of things that are very difficult to teach online, things like strategy and leadership. But it turns out design thinking, because it is so project-based, that is, we only learn it when we do it, it really lends itself to online because people can follow their own projects through the process and take the learning of the next step as they need it, right? And that's turning out to be really very powerful. I think we've had almost 200,000 learners in our Coursera class. And from all over the world and all kinds of organizations and personal endeavors using design thinking for all kinds of things. So it's been very motivating for me who've been a classroom teacher, and it's certainly those of you who know Darden know that it's all about the face-to-face conversation. So I feel very surprised even at myself to have been converted to such a believer in online learning for this one particular aspect, at least of what we teach. And again, let me just end with one of my favorite quotes that is really all about the learning process this is. In a world of change, the learner shall inherit the earth, while the learned shall find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. Right? I think what design thinking can do is put some structure into our learning journey so that we're responding to the needs of the real-life experiences of people, not imposing what we as experts think on them. So thank you so much for being so wonderfully awake after those glasses of wine as we start.
That was, I've learned a lot, and I'm going to be doing the Coursera classes. We're going to have about 5 to 10 minutes to answer some of the questions. And please, right there.
This was fantastic. Thank you so much. A wonderful presentation. You've talked about designers and managers as kind of these 2 archetypes here. You're at a business school. I'm involved in a project that also engages designers and managers, and I find that in addition to the challenge of teaching Georges to think more like designers, part of the problem is to get people who are Jeffs and are not in a business context at all to think more like George, or at least understand how to talk to him. Yeah. And so, you know, if you take all the people that go, not to say Darden, but to a design school, yes. Many of the people that emerge from these schools have very powerful talents, capabilities, creative capacities, and yet they have a mindset that prevents them from engaging with the people at the business schools. And I mean, could we also do a kind of similar step-by-step
intervention
process?
On the Jeff side?
Yeah, intervention on the Jeff side, where we said, you people have to understand the other world that these people come from and learn how to engage with them. And not only that, but understand why it's important to do that.
Yes.
Why that's valuable to you if you want to fulfill your dreams and ambitions. Yeah. What do you say to?
I often joke that designers are their own worst enemies, clearly, right? And that they teach how to have empathy, and they have empathy for everyone except the business people that they're working with, right? That's where they draw the line, right? And I think that's the challenge. You know, in some ways, Jeff desperately needs George, and George desperately needs Jeff, right? They both have a critical capability set, but they tend to gridlock left to their own devices, right? Because the designers, the innovators, they want to go, go, go. They have ideas and they want to run with them. And of course, usually the people with veto power are the Georges of the world, right? And they just say, no, bring me more data, bring me more data, bring me more data. And as a result, you get a stalemate where the Jeffs of the world come to believe that George exists only to thwart their attempts at innovation, right? And George comes to believe Jeff is a crazy person, and if you give them any funding at all, they'll just lose it immediately, right? So a lot of the opportunity is to figure out a method of problem solving, which allows each of them to bring their strengths. In my view, that is the benefit of hypothesis generating and testing. A hypothesis testing methodology takes the veto away from George. That is, if there's an idea and it passes that initial kind of logic screen of the wow zone, instead of telling Jeff, no, don't do anything, I have to let you conduct a small experiment. Now, I get to help you design that experiment so that the experiment actually returns the data that I think is critical. One of the things that we find, it's interesting, even working with managers who are incredibly data-driven, but we are generally not taught to be hypothesis-driven. We're taught as managers to take the data that we've already got and try and figure out how to use it to answer questions. When we teach someone how to be hypothesis-driven, we reverse that process. We say, start with what the assumption is that you're trying to test, and then go get the data that will actually test that assumption, right? And so this idea of even for the data people, the way in which we're working with data in design thinking is in a hypothesis-driven methodology, so it's different, right? And that takes some getting used to, I think. One of the things that we find is if you can get enough mutual respect to actually have them both on the team, there's nothing better than putting George face to face with a stakeholder who's not getting what they need out of the organization, right? It's like anything else. We can harangue our children as their parents about the things they should do differently, but when one of their peers or their favorite uncle or someone like that says the same thing, it gets listened to. Right? So these ethnographic techniques like journey mapping that can be taught to people very quickly, the first conversation they begin to soften and change, right? And then what you're trying to do is align people around the needs of the customer rather than a designer who's often aligned around their own need for novelty, or a business person who's aligned around a need for the organization to do better. Right? And if we can get them to each step away from that, the designer from novelty, the business person from putting the organization first in this process, and say, no, let's try and align ourselves around the genuine needs of the stakeholder we're trying to serve, and then let's talk about what we could do that would be novel to serve that, and then let's talk about how we build a profitable business model around that. It shifts the conversation quite dramatically. But all designers won't go there in the way that all business people won't go there, right? I mean, I think there needs to be a receptivity. One of the things I think in organizations that are succeeding at this is they're going in and they're asking for volunteers. You know, think of Marlis at the Apache Indian Reservation. She wasn't volunteered by her boss to go be an innovator. The organization extended the invitation, and she was the one who took it because she was open to having a different kind of conversation with the people that she worked with. right? And I think that's where we begin. Once we start to see results pile up, then even the skeptical people will get on board. But early on, these processes, these possibility-driven processes, are very fragile. Right? It doesn't take much skepticism or cynicism to kill them early on. And so I think it's very helpful as a leader to protect the process early on by putting people in it who have some shot at identifying with the value system behind it, right? And saving the mandating for later on, where we've got lots of success stories and people can see the business reason, for instance, to behave in different ways. Thank you. I always give short shrift to Jeff and his need for education as well.
Right over here and then over there.
I believe when I was looking at the Jeffs and the Georges, I believe somehow they might reflect as well different cultures, and maybe different cultures affect the ability of someone to be more design thinking oriented. For example, rote learning systems maybe not encourage problem solving skills, because we can discover problems, but being able to translate a problem or an issue into a solution requires maybe more problem solving skills. Some cultures might be more rote learning oriented. Yes. So is that something that you have studied?
Not really. You know, I think this is where we all find our own personal passion, right? I mean, a lot of my interest has been working at the individual level with people to help them figure out how to kind of find the innovator within. Certainly other faculty, though other academics, are studying cultural issues. There's no question that educational systems have a big role in this. For instance, one of the things that Carol Dweck is passionately involved with is the reform of elementary school education in the US, which she believes pushes children into a fixed mindset, right? We're taught very early on, if you're not sure you have the right answer, don't put your hand up and volunteer your ignorance in front of the rest of the class, right? And so kids learn to not volunteer information unless they're sure they're right. Right? We see the same phenomenon at the Darden School. All the Darden alums can remember this. You know, we sit in class and we grade participation very heavily, right? And there's a group of students who wants to be sure they're right before they talk, and they never get a chance to talk because the Jeffs of the world are busy jumping in and sharing half-baked ideas completely comfortably, right? So I think this question of how we create a context that reinforces the right kind of behaviors early on is one. And then clearly there's cultural differences. I mean, this stuff is relatively easy to do in the US. You can stop someone on the street and they'll tell you everything that you want to know about their lives, right? And at some point in a way that you think is more information than you really planned on, right? I think in cultures that are much more discreet and private, this idea of going and talking to strangers and asking them to tell you their emotional journey, right? That's going to take a lot more skill, first of all, right? And just some percentage of the time is going to meet with less success, right? So I do think all of these factors are really important. But again, this is kind of an area where actual academic research with any rigor is really in its infancy. And so we don't know a lot yet about those kinds of questions.
One last question.
Looking at the George and the Jeff analysis, you mentioned that we want to help George to be more creative. What about helping Jeff to find a job in the corporation?
Yes.
Right, because the Jeffs of our work can only make so many mistakes before we get fired.
Yeah.
So, but then Jeffs are the people that actually, in your words, create the most value. The innovative value. So how do we inspire the corporations of our days to, like, also in your words, to protect the values of all the Jeffs?
Yeah. Well, the people who survive long-term and prosper in large organizations are really a combination of the two skills, right? They are people who are empathetic and interested in kind of the lives of people, but who are also good at hypothesis testing. Right? Sometimes one of the usual questions is, well, can you tell me how to find a whole bunch of Jeffs? because most large organizations, at least, have driven most of the Jeffs out of the organization because they just get frustrated, and there's no vehicle for them to have a voice, so they're constantly frustrated, right? Unless they have a lot of credibility, they don't get very far. So everyone knows you need more of them. The trouble is, they're not hard to find, particularly as middle-level managers. Young Jeffs are very hard to find because you can't tell the difference between someone who's kind of a creative, open-minded person and someone who just can't hold a job, because they have a lot of different jobs, right? And having a lot of different jobs can mean I'm building a repertoire, and it can also mean I just can't hold a job, right? But usually by the time someone's reached, most of the managers in our research are in their 40s at least, you can tell they have a successful track record as they've changed all these jobs. So they've had a lot of jobs, but in each job they've accomplished something before they got frustrated because people started to tell them no and they moved on. Because Jeffs are very hard to keep in most organizations because they have a low tolerance for frustration and they are unafraid of trying new things. So they just find somebody else to work for who'll let them do more of what they want, right? So I think the challenge is, in an organizational sense, how do we have enough Jeffs to kind of model a set of behaviors we want, who are respected by the Georges, and then how do we create some processes and systems that allow them to work together and that allow us to not ignore the 90% of the people in our population who have access to the information to make people's lives better. One of the things that we often, we've worked with teachers a lot in this. And a teacher will say, well, I would love to do some different kinds of work and be more creative, but I'm waiting for the school superintendent to decide what our policy is going to be like on educational reform or something like that. The beauty of design thinking is instead you can say to the teacher, you don't have to wait for the school superintendent. It would be very nice if they acted, but in the meantime, you can go into class tomorrow, and with those 15 children, you can make their learning experience better. You don't need anyone's permission to do that. You don't need a lot of money to do that. The whole idea of the small bets unleashes people's ability to take action in the areas that they control. And so I think that's a lot of the opportunity that we have. Certainly there are questions of organizational governance and structure and how we support people and change decision processes and all. But at another level, it's just as easy and fundamental as saying, look, listen to the people that you're trying to serve and think of ways that you can adjust what you do to create more value for them. And sometimes things that can look very small can turn out to be very significant, especially when lots of people do it, right? And so I think that's the democratizing appeal of design thinking, that it can allow us to invite a whole organization into the innovation process, instead of having a whole organization waiting to be told what the innovation opportunities are by a small group of people who have the capability to lead it.
Well, on that note, Jeanne, I want to thank you. This was a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot. And speaking as a Jeff, my staff will know, we've been making a lot of little bets this last 5 years, and it's been great to see the growth of this organization. And I think you reaffirm, but I think Jeff's needs Georges and Georges needs Jeffs. And this is one lesson that I think having an MBA really does help you balance. Nonprofits cannot do what we do without the for-profits. We need donations, we need supports, and I think it's the right side and left side. You need both. So I think your presentation tonight really has been wonderful, and I want to thank you on behalf of Asia Society, a small token of our appreciation. But I hope to have you back. I know you have really kind of sparked a lot of wonderful discussion, and I want to thank all of you for being here. And this is a book about the project.
Oh,
this
wonderful.
Wonderful. This place used to be former Explosive Magazine, and we have turned it into a center for learning and education.
And an explosive magazine of a different kind.
And I often say we explode with ideas. So thank you, Jeanne, and thank you
so much.
And thank you, Dean Beardsley, and thank you all for being here with this wonderful discussion. We look forward to having you all back in the future at Asia Society Hong Kong. Thank you.